My name is Michael Sledge, Assistant Dean of Students here. We're really pleased to have Dr. DiAngelo here on campus. And Dr. Robin DiAngelo is a former Associate Professor of Education. She's a two-time winner of the Students' Choice Award for Educator of the Year. Her scholarship is in white racial identity and race relations. In addition to her academic work, Dr. DiAngelo has extensive experience as a workplace consultant in issues of race education and racial justice. She was appointed to co-design, develop, and deliver the City of Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. She has numerous publications and just completed her second edition of her book, What Does It Mean to Be White? Developing White Racial Literacy. Her work on white fragility has been featured in Alternet, Salon.com, NPR, and Colorlines. She has asked, because of the limited amount of time and the number of folks in the room, that you save questions, and there'll be some Q&A at the end. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robin DiAngelo.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to project my voice, and at some point in here, the mic will arrive, and that'll be a little bit of a relief. So really limited time. I'm going to try not to rush, but you know, this is such a sensitive and charged topic. And so I want to start by drawing attention to my race, or my racial position. I am white, and I am coming from a white frame of reference, a white worldview, and I have a white experience. And that is this experience and the perspective I am speaking from today. And I'm primarily speaking to other white folks on what it means to be white in a society that proclaims it doesn't mean anything, and yet is profoundly separate and unequal by race. So that is the question that drives my work. How do we pull that off? How do we pull off that narrative in the face of so much racial inequity? Now, this can also be really useful for people of color, even though I'm talking directly to white people, because I'm going to name and admit to things that white people will rarely ever name or admit to, and that can help with the crazy making. And none of us get good information on how race works, right? People of color very early on have to figure out my reality as well as their own, where I only have to know my own reality. And so it can also just be useful to get some kind of framework for making sense of our experiences, okay? And so I'm going to start, where are we? By every measure across every institution, there is racial disparity, all right? So every measure, every institution, empirical evidence. Right? And at the same time, this is today's dominant racial narrative. Okay? What I'm about to show you comes from an anonymous essay from one of my students, first day of class, about to go forth and be teachers in public schools, juniors and seniors in university, about to be certified as highly educated by our institutions of higher learning, and in a program that's 98% white. And where I was teaching was 10 miles from a city that is 57% black and Latino. So explicit segregation. And this is about all they could be, it's verbatim. So this is as much as they could be bothered to write about what messages they've gotten about race across their life. My neighborhood growing up was not racially diverse at all. Every family in my neighborhood was also Caucasian. Throughout my time in school, I've continually been taught that skin does not matter. Do you recognize this narrative? Mm-hmm. This is today's dominant racial narrative. It's the narrative you've been given too. I'm comfortable saying that. And I see a huge contradiction in here. Anybody else see a contradiction? Mm-hmm. If it doesn't matter, why do we live so separately? And then maybe another question is, how do we teach that race doesn't matter in racial segregation, right? And yet, again, this is the ubiquitous, these are young people, this isn't, you know, just my age. So let's think about how we pull that off. And in part is that we don't understand what racism is, right? So the dominant narrative uses prejudice, discrimination, and racism interchangeably. They are not the same things, right? So we're talking like this because we're using these terms differently. So just quickly, prejudice is prejudgments. We get them from everywhere across our lifespan, right? Not just whatever your parents taught you, right? We get them from everywhere, constantly messages that have us forming prejudgments about other social groups. right? All human beings have prejudice. It's not humanly possible not to, because human objectivity is not possible. And I know you're in a university, but I'm going to say it right now, there's no human objectivity. Okay? Human beings can only make sense of the world through the cultural frame they're conditioned to make sense of it through. Okay? And when we act on what's in our head, right, prejudice is kind of what's in our head, we're now discriminating. Everybody does it, right? The best shot you have at not doing it is to know what's in your head, and a lot of what's in your head is way deep down. But the challenge here is that we're taught that it would be bad to be prejudiced. So all that does is have us protecting our misinformation rather than examining it. All right. So we can remove the word reverse from any discussion of these issues. It's not necessary. Everybody has it, everybody does it. But when you back a group's collective prejudice by control of all of the institutions, you transform it. Because now that group is in the position to embed and infuse and build their prejudice into the very fabric of the society. And that fundamentally impacts the other group in far-reaching ways without any one individual needing to do anything. Right? So oppression is legal authority and institutional control, or prejudice backed by. Right? Okay. And it gets embedded in all institutions and also in cultural definitions of what is normal, beautiful, correct, and valuable. Whose experience is attested to and whose is not. Who acts correctly and who doesn't, right? All right. So there are different forms, right? The ism words are generally, they allow us to speak to different forms of oppression. So we, kind of what form are we talking about now? So when you hear the ism words, sexism, classism, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, heterosexism, ableism, adultism, right? So it just kind of lets us, oh, which form are we talking about? So I want to use an example from sexism to launch us into talking about racism. So women got the right to vote in 1920. Who gave it to us? Okay. Men. Was there any other way for women to get the vote except for men to give it to us? No. Why not? Because we're not literally seated at the seats of institutional power. Could a woman be prejudiced and discriminate against a man individually? Absolutely. Right? Could women as a group oppress men, take away their right to vote, give themselves the right to vote? No. And you have to have some language that acknowledges that difference because it's a profound difference. And when you use it as if it's all the same, you take that off the table. Okay, and keep in mind many things that relate to this. Every institution worked together to make this take decades and decades of struggle. Okay, so not just the House and the Senate. All right, every institution. So the clergy, the male-dominated clergy, literally preached from the pulpit that it was God's will. Now, try coming up against God's will. I mean, you're basically screwed, right? I mean, there's no way, right? God's will and the men who speak for him, okay? The psychiatrists, male-dominated psychiatrists, wrote the studies that said women are inherently irrational. The medical doctors, also male-dominated, who wrote the studies that said, I'm not kidding you, look it up. If a woman uses her brain, the blood will flow upward, away from the uterus. The babies aren't going to be very good. Can't have that. And ultimately, the military, the police, if women were to revolt. Okay? So it's a very deeply entrenched kind of connected system of institutional power and legal authority, okay? And of course, obviously there were men who had to advocate for women, eventually get enough other men going on it so that they finally granted it to us. But they still benefited from patriarchy, right? Those men still benefited from a system that denied more than half the population the ability to vote. Okay. So that's what when we talk about everybody in the dominant group benefits from that privilege, regardless of their intentions or how nice they are or how hard they're working, they still benefit. Okay. So let me ask you a question. Today, if men as a group wanted to take away our right to vote, could they? Okay, so let's just notice, right? Because even the way we have the conversation is part of the conversation, is part of how it works, right? That kind of, I saw a lot of no's, maybe not sure's. Or it does not seem like a question you would want to answer right away. All right, well, let's take a look, right? This is 2016. Fortune 500 CEOs, 98% male. I believe that this is the ultimate power above all other forms. All right. This is the U.S. Senate. It's 80% male. This is the House of Representatives. It's 82% male. This is the Supreme Court. It's 66% male. Don't mean to pick on the Republicans, but when I see a picture like this, you know it's going in my slideshow. Just take it in. The weight of that patriarchy. Who sits at the tables? Legal authority, institution of control. These are the most powerful committees that will make decisions that impact all of our lives, right? Presidency and vice presidency. Always the vice presidency till 2009 presidency. Pretty sure we're going back to it. I couldn't find a picture of the vice president, so I just doubled the presidents, just so you would get the impact. All right. So let me just ask you again. If they wanted to, could they? Yeah. You see that difference? That was like 20 seconds. And this is basic information in front of every one of us every day. But this is also how oppression works. It's so normalized, taken for granted. There's so much ideology. You know, women are now, liberated, and it's only in other countries, and et cetera, right? Oppression is deeply rooted, historic. It is not fluid. It doesn't change overnight. Patriarchy didn't end in 1920. Thank you. And I'm really sure that if Hillary Clinton becomes president, patriarchy won't end on that day, right? All right. So we can take the word reverse out of here too. Mm-hmm. There is no reverse sexism. I just sit with that. If that bugs you, great. Use it as a door in. That often makes people really uncomfortable. There is no reverse racism. Because when we use the ism terms, we're acknowledging institutional power, legal authority, deeply embedded historical relationship. Now, I wish we had new words, because people are real attached to these words. But we don't. And until we get there, when social scientists use these terms, they're acknowledging that difference. To not acknowledge it, to say it's all the same, is to completely obscure the reality of true power. Okay? All right, and I've been looking at a little bit, I gave you a little bit of economics and a little bit of government, but just to get a taste of culture, this is last month's cover of Vanity Fair. And that's the text. Why late night TV is better than ever, right? From whose perspective, right? Who are our cultural leaders, narrators, etc.? All right, we live in patriarchy. Okay. And, Facebook, I don't know if you ever noticed, they put out these little happy holiday things, Happy Friendship Day, this was a Happy Women's Equality Day, and I always knew it was 1920, but I didn't know it was August 26th, so on the 26th they sent this out. And then somebody did this. Which women got the right to vote in 1920? And actually, you said it, but I was ignoring you because I couldn't get a punchline there. White women got the right to vote. I wasn't taught white women, I was just taught women. And that's another way that oppression works. The dominant group's experience stands in as everybody's experience, right? While we were oppressed as women, we were privileged as white women. There's not a universal woman's experience. Race, class, sexuality profoundly shape how you're going to experience your gender, right? Okay. So racism is a form of oppression. It is a system that's embedded in everything and works to the result of unequal distribution of resources between white people and people of color overall, and with white people the beneficiaries of that distribution, regardless of intentions, self-image, or whether you were in the Peace Corps. Okay? All right. So Marilyn Frye has the image of a bird cage to capture oppression. I think it's a beautiful image or metaphor. That if you look at this bird really close up, you're not going to see the cage at all, right? If you put your face against that, it's like looking through a hole in a fence, and because you're taking a very micro or myopic view, and you're looking at the individual bird, and you're saying, what's the problem? The little door is open. Why doesn't it just fly away? And if you step back and you start to take a macro view, you begin to see these wires, and then these wires, and then these wires, and you begin to see this interlocking network or web of barriers that while they don't make it impossible for that bird to fly away, they make it unlikely. They enable us to predict the chances, just how we can literally predict how long people of color will live based on their racial assignment. And certainly it's going to make that bird face barriers that a bird outside the cage, right, won't face. So let's look at what some of those bars are. Our institutions, our ideologies, our history, our culture, microaggressions, the continual threat of violence, internalized oppression, rewards for conformity, isolation, the burden of representation, invisibility, unacknowledged historical trauma, to name a few. And I think any person of color on a campus like this, whether you be student, faculty, or staff, can probably relate to isolation, burden of representation, rewards for conformity, invisibility. Okay? And that's another reason why, I mean, we just cannot use these terms interchangeably as if they cover everybody's, experience or reaction. So this is my metaphor, because I do love them. And it came to me as I listened to white people talk about race and racism, and I heard the same things over and over, and I got this image of a dock or a pier. And what that signifies for me is the superficial or surface nature of these narratives, right? Because it looks like it's just floating on the water. So let's see what some of those are. I was taught to treat everyone the same. Anybody ever heard that? All right. No, you weren't. I'm going to say that again. No, you were not. You cannot teach human beings to treat everyone the same. We do not treat everyone the same. You can tell them. You can put the poster in the hallway outside the Multicultural Center. You can't actually teach that, right? And so this is just someone who doesn't understand basic socialization, honestly, which is most of us. I see people as individuals. I don't care if you're pink, purple, yellow, or polka dotted. Racism's in the past, doesn't have any meaning to me. Everyone struggles. My parents weren't racist. That's why I'm not racist. My parents were racist. That's why I'm not racist. It doesn't matter what comes in front, what comes behind must always be, I'm not racist. And so just happened to be black has nothing to do with the conflict. Okay, that's another one I would actually remove. Anything that leads with just happened to be or regardless of is just a colorblind claim that you actually can't make. In this society, there is no way you can say race has nothing to do with a cross-racial conflict, any more than you can say gender does. I might not know what it has to do, but it's in there, right? Because the conditioning is so deep that you just can't, even the way, when we think about gender, even the emotions that I've been conditioned to express, the way that I hold my body, all of it is always in there, okay? So these are colorblind narratives, and some of us in the room may still have these. They're ubiquitous. But if we're a little more sophisticated, we know that colorblind is not really possible and not really working. But I'll get us too. So if we're more sophisticated, we're kind of Northwest liberals. We shop at the co-op. We drive Priuses, and we went to Fairhaven. Then we don't use those. But what do we say? Here's what we say. We say, oh, I work in a very diverse environment. I have people of color in my family. I used to live in New York. Okay. So let's look at these. How many of you that used to live in New York maybe is just, I mean, I've heard it. I've actually had people give me that as their evidence. You know, I'm like, oh my God, that's incredible. You walked by people of color and you didn't lose your shit. You are incredible. Oh my God. All right. So let's look at these two. How many of you in a discussion of racism with a white person have heard some version of those? Okay, just look at that, right? We got a whole range of ages in here. So this person who says this is giving you their evidence, right? This is my evidence. In my mind, what is it my evidence of? What am I trying to establish with you? It's not a hard question. I'm not racist, right? Here's my evidence. If that's my evidence, how am I defining racism? What's my definition of racism? That would be my evidence that I'm not that. That a racist has conscious dislike of people of color. When I say conscious, I mean they don't like people of color and they know it. And I guess they couldn't tolerate being 3 cubicles down from somebody, right? And actually, I assure you, even a conscious racist could tolerate working in an environment that had people of color in it. Okay. So the reason why I think that's really important to be able to basically do discourse analysis, to go under the surface and figure out what is the framework of meaning that this person is drawing from that would lead them to make those claims. Then you know how to speak to it, right? And it also helps with your own claims. Like, what am I really saying, right? What does that tell me about what I believe that how this is or how it works? I would also say having people of color in your family, that's important, that's key, and that does not free you of racism. Racism is going to be in the relationship, it's going to be in your lives, it's going to be in how you experience the world when you're together, when you're separate. It's same with it, gender. I like to ask cisgendered people that are in opposite sex relationships, like the women in the room. How many women in the room have in a primary relationship with a man? All right. The day he fell in love with you, his sexism evaporated, right? No? But he loves you. How could he have any sexism whatsoever? How about, okay, we'll go this way. Your ex. Does he have any sexism? Because you probably think your current ones are really cool, but how about the ex? Okay. You see my point? I call on gender a lot because I think we're able to recognize, of course you can't remove gender, but when it comes to race, we just think that it's so simple, right? What else do we have? Children are so much more open, right? So this narrative about, children being innocent, and they may be born innocent, but the research shows that by age 3, children know the racial order. And I'm going to say it directly and bluntly. All children growing up in this society know very early on that it's better to be white. And if you have a child of color, you're going to have to really help them with that. You cannot ignore that message. And so this narrative of children as innocent, it just has us not preparing our children or not enabling them to actually challenge racism. I already know all this. I took that class. I went to Costa Rica on an eco tour. I'm trying to think of what else. Anyone who says to me, and trust me in this work, I get this a lot, anyone who says this to me just told me that they don't, because you would never say that. This is so deep, so complex, so lifelong. You will never be through. And the messages are coming at you 24/7. You've got to be, it's a lifelong work, right? And that lack of humility is really problematic, right? We don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we had to move here for the schools. I could do a whole workshop on that. I just find it really disingenuous. Okay. So in trying to kind of really unpack this, I've had to go under the surface. right? And think about what are we drawing from? And that's what I want to map out in the next part of this. What enables us to make these really kind of absurd, very shallow, superficial claims in the face of such segregation, right, and inequality? So I think that probably the most effective adaptation of racism post-civil rights is you make racism so bad no white person will look at it in themselves. It is, the good-bad binary is probably the root of any defensive interaction you've ever had with a white person, any argument you've ever had on Facebook, whatever it is. This idea that to connect me to racism is to say that I'm immoral. And then you do that, I'm going to put all my energy into deflecting that connection, into convincing you that I am not. And of course, it functions beautifully to hold racism in place. So we know that it's an either-or proposition, and a racist is bad. They're old, they're Southern, they drive pickup trucks. We've got to get some classism in there. And, you know, if they're not racist, then, you know, they're, you know, vegan and... by the way, I am vegetarian. I like to make fun of myself, too. Okay, because when I started this work, I actually did think those were my qualifications. I shopped at the co-op and I was a vegetarian. So I understood this. And I actually think the progressive white like me is the hardest. We are the hardest, because we are going to fight you to connect us to looking at this. So I want you to just think to yourself about a couple questions. I want you to think about how racially diverse your neighborhood or neighborhoods, if you move frequently, were growing up. And if you are, like most white people across this nation, you grew up in racial segregation. I use my words very deliberately. Most white people grow up in racial segregation. And of course, you also grew up in a good neighborhood. All right. And the messages we get from racial segregation are, normally I would have us actually discussing this, but because of time I'll just lay it out. It's normal, it's natural, it's preferable, that we live in the good places, that they live in the dangerous places, that they're dangerous, that they're scary, that white spaces are racially neutral, that there's no race in a white neighborhood, that they have race, we don't, that white neighborhoods are just accidents or just flukes, or we just happen to be really fortunate, as opposed to white neighborhoods are the result of decades of policies and practices that keep them white and made them white. And every moment we spend in an all-white space, we are being reinforced in white worldview, preference for segregation. They're a living, breathing, active. Okay? Race is not only happening when people of color enter. Okay? Oh, I should just say for anyone who's, well, I'm less racist than you because I grew up in an integrated neighborhood. The one exception to this is white folks who didn't grow up in segregation were probably urban and working class or poor. And you probably no longer live in that neighborhood because upward mobility would take you away, and you know that. If you're going to improve your life, you're going to move away into a wider space, and we don't tend to maintain those early relationships, and we don't really get encouraged to do that either. Okay? Second question, think about when's the first time you had a teacher of your own race? And when's the first time you had a teacher of a different race? Or races if you're multiracial. And how often? And if you're like most white folks, their answer to this is, from the time I began, and I could get a graduate degree without ever having a teacher of color, or I could name the third grade Spanish teacher, the coach, right? Maybe a professor. If you're a person of color, rarely, if ever. If you're black and you grew up in certain parts of Atlanta or DC, you may. But for the most part, never. So if you're white, you're relentlessly reflected by the people in authority at the front of the room who get to decide whether you're smart or good or clean or what your families are like or what they care about. And given that we grew up in such segregation, where do we get our messages about people of color? Well, from the worst possible sources, right? Media, movies, television, music, friends, omissions, jokes, warnings. But now we're in the position, think about teachers, all those white teachers who answer these questions like most all other white people. They're not more racist than any other group of white people, but they're in a really, really powerful position. And basically you've got the school to prison pipeline. Again, it's empirical evidence shows that white teachers treat students of color much, much differently on every measure. And the teaching force is getting more white. It's 83 to 93% white nationwide. And we're almost back to pre-Brown versus Board of Education levels of school segregation. I think this is a crisis, personally. And this is just one thread in one institution, right? And I have a friend who puts it like this, and since it gives me the chills, I'll do it for you. Pretty much all of us have been taught by white people, who've 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 been taught by white people, using textbooks written for, by, and about white people. I want you to get the depth and the weight of our socialization. It is not just do I or don't I tell jokes. It is so deep in the water. It shapes every person in this room. I was thinking about how to illustrate that. And so I like to use images. So this is from the College Jeopardy Champion Playoffs. So these are our best and our brightest. These are, you know, college champions. And that is the board at the end of the round. The grand champion round, and as we can see, there was one category not one of those really smart kids touched. And obviously that was the hardest category, and they didn't want to lose. For me, that would be astrophysics. I like to say, it could say algebra, and I wouldn't touch it. All right. I actually don't know how to articulate the profundity of that. That we cannot challenge racism if we don't know our history and how we came. And I don't just mean the way we even teach African American history when we do teach it. I mean truly the hundreds of years foundation and being able to trace those policies into the present time. So Joe Fegan is a sociologist who talks about the white racial frame, and in a way it's the same kind of idea of those pillars that are propping up the dock I showed you. It's the framework through which whites make racial meaning and that are passed down. So I'm going to begin to show you images that surround us every day. Keep in mind that for every image I show you, there are millions that have gone before that connect and cohere to that image and make it readable for us. So I'm freezing one from the millions that come around us all the time. You don't have to read Vogue magazine for that to be impacting you. This is an ad. I was on a Delta flight and I saw this and I was like, oh my God, I have to have that ad. Look at it. I mean, it's so, the first reaction I had to it was, look at the racial hierarchy, how clear it is in this. You have your white women in front with red hair wearing green, your Asian women in the middle wearing yellow, and your black women in the back wearing brown. That's the first thing. Now look at their hands. This is an ad for a purse. The black women don't even have the purse, right? And again, it's so quick. We're just reading this. This is an ad, a little bit older, for Intel. Multiply computing performance and maximize the power of your employees. There's 6 shirtless black men kneel at his feet. You know when you're reading like CNN online or something and all those things are flashing at the bottom, you know, look at Harold Mirren in a bathing suit, or look at this sea creature they found in the, You ever see those? They're really distracting, and you're trying to read the article, and you want to see what did they find in the bottom of the ocean. All right. This one got my attention because it said most beautiful women from around the world. And representing South Africa, which is 92% black, Charlize Theron. To me, this is white supremacy. There was not one Asian woman in that spread. Asian women are the majority of all women on the planet. So I want to talk about what it means to be white, or how white has shaped my life. That happens to be the cover of my book. So how does all of this water kind of set us up and reinforce us? Well, I was born into a culture in which I belong. I belong in almost any situation deemed normal, neutral, or valuable. I belong at that faculty meeting. I belong at that church service, that block party, dealing with my daughter's teachers, her camp counselors, that wedding. I am never the only one or one of a few. Belonging is a deeply internalized dynamic. It's in my bones, it's in my muscles, my posture, my health, what I reach for. Belonging. Don't ever take it for granted, but it is not granted to everyone. And everything I'm going to say in this part cannot be said by a person of color in this society. Representing the government, let's look at stats for race. 93% white Senate, House of Representatives 83, Supreme Court 66. I don't know that there's a more powerful image than God. And I grew up Catholic, so this is what I saw. There's God creating man. There's Jesus and Mary, right? And as a child, I didn't look up and say, oh, God is white. I mean, that's just the relentless power of it, right? Always reflected. Whites are the norm for humanity. You know, there's film directors, and then there's black film directors, and there's writers, and then there's, right? But I thought I would represent this way. You've all seen those in your science classes? Okay, here's a close-up. Even with their skin off, they're white. Oh, you know how I fell out when I saw that. I'm like, oh my God. There's Adam and Eve, the first human beings, which, by the way, came from the continent of Africa, the first human beings. Constant messages that it's better to be white, and I'm just choosing from magazine covers. Best hair, Halle Berry's in there, but her hair is straightened. World's most beautiful woman, sexiest man alive. Okay, I mean, it's ridiculous on a really obvious level, but again, in terms of whiteness as a signifier for ideal. This little girl is the world's top model. I don't know if you know that, top child model, and she's been dubbed world's most beautiful girl. This is on a scientific website right now. Is this the perfect face? And I'm really sorry, but this ran in 2011, Psychology Today. And look at the pseudo-scientific grid on her face, as if this is some kind of natural scientific truth. I was racially affirmed throughout my childhood, and I'm going to choose images from today. Our movies are exported worldwide. They impact all children. This is what I mean when I say no child misses the message. It's better to be white. That's Ayala Jones. She's a little girl that was killed in a police shootout in her home. What's particularly poignant for me about that photo is look at her posed with those Disney princesses. We'll have to get the boys because childhood is so gendered. These are our cultural narrators. Those who write and direct film shape all of our understandings of everything. And so we're so deeply kind of shaped by the stories of films. Oh, get you. This is an Academy Award winning film. I think that picture right there for me sums the movie up. I found it a deeply, deeply racist movie. but highly celebrated. That remind me a lot of that picture. Here's another image from The Blind Side, right? At some point he goes back to his neighborhood. These are the images I've seen my whole life associated with black and brown space. And then the white mother saves him. And look at that abundance and Christian benevolence. Well, it's good news. We got some people of color in this ad. But if you're trying to find them, they'll be where they usually are, which is at the end or the sides. They're not going to be in the middle. They're not going to be the center. All of these shows we grew up with across the decades. So Seinfeld's the 80s, Sex and the City in the 90s, Friends in the 2000s, this is Gossip Girl, and this is Girls, right? So many of us know these shows, grew up with these shows. They're all about ideal friendship, right? Every one of these shows takes place in New York City. Arguably the most racially diverse city in the US. Every one of them, ideal friendship is segregated. No need, even amongst diversity, to truly integrate. These two proud people made an app called Sketch Factor. And when you go to a new city, you use the app and it tells you where the sketchy neighborhoods are. So you can be sure to avoid those. And sketchy is around class and race, right? I'd like to turn this whole narrative of good white neighborhoods on its ear. Like, from whose perspective, right? Is it safe or not dangerous? But I want to end with probably the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race. And I'm going to start with the fact that I could be born into, and even where I was born, how accessible was health services to my mother. What about transportation? What about nutrition? What about insurance? How was she treated by the healthcare system? Who delivered me? Who owned the hospital? Who took the trash out that night? I was born into a racial hierarchy from the time I opened my eyes, right? So I could be born into, I could learn, I could play, I could worship, I could study, I could love, I could work, and I could die in racial segregation, and not one person who's ever taught, mentored, or guided me has ever conveyed to me that I've lost anything. I'm going to say this a few times in a few ways, because I want to get us way past this I have friends of color and don't tell racist jokes. Okay? I want us to see how deeply rooted, because this is the depth of which we have to try to unroot it. Okay? If I followed the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me, I just live my life, right? I go to school, I grow up in my good neighborhood, my good school, my good college degree, at my good university, my good job. I could easily, just following the trajectory of life, I could easily have no cross-racial relationships. Most white people don't. And no one has ever suggested I've lost anything. In fact, white people measure the value of our spaces by the absence of people of color. We all know what a good neighborhood is, and we know what a good school is. Every utterance of that is saying it's good because it's white. Right? So then I get to this point in life. What is the fundamental message of segregation that we call good? The fundamental message is there is no inherent value in the perspectives, experiences, or relationships with people of color. There's no inherent value. My parents loved me. They didn't see any value there to change the direction of our lives or my life. And so then you get to this point, and you guys are in college, you're going to be the gatekeepers, you're going to be sitting at the tables of power. It's hard to even notice those perspectives are missing. Our whole life, everyone in front of us with authority has been, for the most part, white. We've got this covered. What do we need their thinking for? But if we kind of do some diversity initiative, we have to get one on every committee. It's often how we do it. At a fundamental level, if I don't really see that perspective as valuable, I'm going to have a hard time taking it in and responding to it. And this often happens to people of color when they are the one token person in a group, is we don't really even listen to them, or we dismiss what they have to say if we don't understand it, right? And that's another way that it gets reproduced, right? I want to move way beyond this idea that yes, I have privilege, right? I mean, that's just a huge deal if you can get white people to acknowledge that. I want to say my psychosocial development, you guys ever taken any of that psychosocial development theory and Piaget and all that? I want you to look at this water and tell me that a white child and a child of color we can just do some universal theory on their psychosocial development. No. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That's what this is. And I need to be ever vigilant to keep challenging it and keep challenging it, because everything out there pushes me not to see this, not to name this, not to talk about this, not to resist this. It's powerfully seductive. So we have to figure out what are we going to put in place to keep this on the table. And all this, of course, leads to white fragility, so I'll just say, be sure to read that. Read my work on white fragility. Okay, so let's look at these frames. If we think about what props up new racism, right? This is kind of what Bonilla Silver talks about, racism without racists. Nobody's racist anymore, and yet we have this inequity, right? This good-bad binary is primary. Whoops. Individualism, this idea that we're all unique and I can be exempt from any of this because here's here's all the ways I'm different. Universalism, which is also, I get to represent all of humanity, right? The power of implicit bias, which you can't miss getting messages of Black and brown people's inherent inferiority. Those messages are all around us. I tried to show you the flip side as kind of the messages of our superiority, because so often talks on race focus on people of color and don't put the lens on us. Internalized superiority and investment. I'm invested in this system. How could I not be invested in this? And I have investments I don't even know I have, but I'm committed. I'm trying to constantly uproot that, which is also why when someone gives me feedback on my inevitable but often unaware racist patterns, I say thank you so much. Wouldn't that be fantastic if we get to a place where we actually felt grateful that someone helped us see something that we couldn't see, instead of outraged and hurt and defensive, which is generally how it goes? And again, the power of segregation, I think, is a huge kind of linchpin in what maintains racial inequity. And it's like we have these split consciousness, right? On this hand, I really have been taught not to see this, right? It's kind of a willful or aggressive ignorance. White people kind of aggressively don't want to see this and push back. And after a while, I'm kind of in that too. So I really can become oblivious to it. It's not an innocence. Again, I work at it, but I really don't see it. I've been taught not to see it. And on the other hand, oh, come on, we all know. We all know. But we can never admit it. That makes for a not a really great stew inside there that makes us kind of irrational. White folks of color in the room, ever notice any white irrationality on this topic? Okay, so when we change those pillars, I think we're going to change the water, right? When we change this, all of these ways that we think about ourselves. So what I will end with is this system actually depends on white people just being really nice and carrying on. Just be really nice. Go out to lunch occasionally with that coworker of yours that's a person of color, and just carry on. And now, I'm not saying don't be nice, but I am saying being nice is not doing anything. We need to keep it on the table, put it on the table, keep it on the table, have courage. Always ask who's missing, whose viewpoint is this? I mean, just like kind of key critical thinking, which you guys are university, and I hope to God your professors are helping you with, right? So let me see how I want to end that. Okay, I'm just going to put this up here, and I guess the last thing I want to say is I hope it's pretty clear that I'm a fairly empowered person. In other words, I am not racked with guilt. I don't feel guilty about this. I feel absolutely responsible, and I'm clear as a bell. To not do anything is to collude. There is no neutral space, right? But it's actually the most transformative work you can ever be engaged in. It's fantastic. So with that, I thank you.